So can the Fujifilm X-T3 hang with full frame cameras for low light wedding photography? What's up guys, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. So for those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So when it comes to low light wedding photography, I'm sure we can all agree that full frame cameras have pretty much become the industry standard. With that said, I've just about wrapped up my first wedding season shooting exclusively with the Fujifilm X-T3 as my main workhorse wedding camera. In a past video, I've explained my reasoning for making the controversial switch from my full-frame Nikon D750s over to the Fujifilm X-T3 crop cameras. And I've also made an extensive one-year review of the camera, which lays out all my experiences and observations from using the X-T3 as my main workhorse camera for weddings this year. But despite these two in-depth videos, the burning and persistent question that everyone still has is, how does the Fujifilm X-T3 do for low-light wedding photography? Well, instead of telling you, I'm going to show you guys. In this video, I'm going to give you guys the GoPro behind-the-scenes perspective of probably the most difficult low-light situation that you can face on a wedding day. A low-light church ceremony where flash is not allowed. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So ideally, I always show up early to every different location on the wedding day, and the first thing that I do is capture detail shots, and I do this for a few reasons. First, it gives some good establishing shots for the wedding gallery to kind of set the stage of where the next story events are taking place, but more importantly, on the technical side, it gives me the time to start to gauge the lighting conditions that I'm going to be dealing with. On the creative side, it just kind of warms up my eye and gets my mind going in that photography mindset so that I can start seeing light and compositions. So I'm using the 16mm 1.4 to accentuate the architecture of this church. The composition is centered, it's symmetrical, and the horizons are level. And after I get that horizontal shot, I also switch over to a vertical composition in order to capture kind of like the arches of the church's architecture at the top. So I'm just going through some more detail shots here, and I actually noticed that the stained glass windows would be a pretty cool shot, except it's a pretty high dynamic range situation since you're trying to capture the color of the window light as well as the shadows of the walls and whatnot. So I switch over to the bracketing drive mode in order to try to capture a 7-shot bracketed burst. So if you want more details on how exactly I set this up, check out my 1-year Fujifilm X-T3 review video as I spell out exactly how I set this up. The cool thing about the bracketed burst is you basically don't have to worry at all about kind of the dynamic range limitation of a crop sensor camera, since you can take 7 different shots and kind of pick the best RAW, the one that has the most data after the fact in post. So after I take the detail shots, my next kind of task before the ceremony starts is kind of dial in my exposure settings in preparation for the wedding procession. And if you get lucky, some of the guests will even actually come down the center aisle, which will be a great gauge of the exposure needed for the actual wedding procession. So now I want to kind of give you my general approach for shooting in these high ISO low light situations, especially on a crop censored body like the Fujifilm X-T3. Ideally, I'd like to maintain a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, but for this wedding it wasn't really possible. So with that, I actually will go down to 1/160th of a second or even 1/125th of a second, but no slower than that. And the reason why I don't go lower than that is because I'm trying to make sure that there's no motion blur of my subject. And the next thing that I try to do is keep my ISOs as low as possible, but always while still maintaining that shutter speed of at least 1/160th or so. And then the last thing is I do not underexpose my photos when I'm going into higher than the base ISO. I guess like around like 800 ISO or more, I never underexpose, just because if you try to push it up in post, you're going to introduce a lot of unwanted noise. And I don't really have a hard or fast rule about the highest ISO that I'll use, but in general, I don't typically have to shoot above ISO 3200 with the large aperture lenses that I use. And keep in mind that this is when I'm exposing the photos correctly. I'm not underexposing any of the photos on purpose. So next I want to talk about my autofocus settings for the procession. Basically, I use AFC or autofocus continuous, and I set that to single point. And I size the point to be as small as kind of like a face at the end, the opposite side of the aisle. And I set that to continuous set 2, which is avoid obstacles and to keep tracking. So as they move down the aisle, I am manually moving my point I don't have face detect on, and as they move closer I just try to keep the small focus point on kind of the main eyeball that I want to focus on. And I also have the camera set to boost mode. I'm not sure if that makes a huge difference, but I take comfort in knowing that the camera is using as much processing power to do all the autofocus calculations that it needs to do. And for the procession, I strategically set up on the side that is opposite of the groom. And this is basically so that I have the ability to capture his reaction as the bride is coming down the aisle. So now that the groom is coming down the aisle with his parents, my initial baseline exposure is 1/160th of a second at f1.2 at 1600 ISO. And as they're coming down, I actually want to kind of point out this doorway to the left right here. Just remember that. I'm going to explain how I use that later on. I also wanted to apologize as because I chest mounted the GoPro, my hand and my wrist sometimes get in the way of the shot. So in the future, I will mount probably the GoPro on my shoulder instead. So during the procession, I'm switching pretty much between the 56mm 1.2 and I have the 16mm 1.4 on my other body for a safety shot and also just for documenting any interactions that happen at the front of the aisle. So if you remember that doorway that I pointed out, I basically use it as a rim light coming from the left to help the subject stand out. So if you see, it's kind of like highlighting the side of this groomsman's face here. And as the procession is going on, I'm pretty much defaulting to center composition, as my main goal here is really to just get like one clean shot of each person or group of people that are processing down the aisle. And I did want to address that, yes, I'm shooting this wide open with the 56mm 1.2, which is pretty much the most complained about lens for slow autofocus. The autofocus is keeping up, especially with the X-T3, and the sharpness is fine, so you should be okay. And then now once the ring bearer and the flower girl is coming in, it's basically a warning to me that the bride will be coming very soon or coming up next. So by this point in the procession, my settings are pretty much dialed in and it's just kind of like my muscle memory and my instinctual reaction kind of take over. So now here the music is changing and I pretty much just pop out, go right into the middle of the aisle and capture this epic wide shot. Because I'm getting a little bit lower, it really gives this nice kind of like X pattern that shows like leading lines going straight to the bride. And I also wanted to include the top kind of archway of the church to kind of accentuate that architecture again. And if you notice, immediately after I took that shot, some guests decide to move right in the middle of the aisle for some reason. So as the bride and her parents are making their way down the aisle, I move over back to the groom to capture his reactions. And again, I'm just focusing more on the moment in the story rather than getting perfect or interesting compositions. And here I just kind of go back and forth between the groom and the bride processing down. Then I switch over to the 16mm and get in a little bit closer to capture the father handing off the bride to the groom. So after the handoff, I exhale a bit and I set my camera back to autofocus single or AFS single point, as it's more accurate in low light situations and I find that it hunts less than AFC. And after a few more shots, I head to the back of the church to do the straight down the aisle shots. First one is the telephoto using the 56. And after I get that telephoto shot, I go over to the 16mm to get a wide shot. And now that I got these shots out of the way, it's pretty much my time to free roam and I change over to a tighter focal length. So I switch to the 90mm f2 and just moving around discreetly and slowly, I just kind of like snipe any moments that I see or any important parts of the ceremony. And on the topic of being discreet, you can actually hear how loud the Sony a7 III's burst shutter is. After this happened, I kind of had to pull my second shooter to the side and ask them to bump down to like 3 frames per second because it was just getting a little too distracting for how I personally wanted to capture the ceremony. And when I'm shooting with the 90mm f2, obviously I can't open up to a larger aperture than that. So that forces me to get into kind of like my higher upper limit of ISO 3200. Again, just roaming around, just taking closer crops of basically the main parts of the ceremony. And anytime they have like a reader or anything, they handpick that reader from amongst their family and friends, so I make sure to grab a photo of those things. And after roaming a little bit, I head back to the back and I do some just kind of experimental shots. Here I take a pocket mirror just to do kind of like a reflection effect type of shot of the entire church. does kind of give again that kind of like X pattern leading line effect, and it also just kind of draws the eye in because of the highlights of the windows with the couple straight in the center of all that. Let me know down in the comments below if you want me to do kind of a tutorial on how I use like this little pocket mirror to take reflection shots. And at this point they're starting to do kind of like the vow exchange and the ring exchange. I start off by taking a wider shot with the 23mm 1.4. And again, always switching between kind of like a wide lens and a tight lens. I capture one with the 90mm f2. And you'll notice that I actually am shooting at 1/125th of a second, which I don't think really was on purpose. My ISO is at ISO 2000, which I probably could have bumped that up to 3200 so I can get a more comfortable, faster shutter speed, but I probably was just in a rush. So I roll over to the side of the church again to get some reactions as they're doing the vow exchange. And here I'm shooting on the side that's getting the groom's reaction, and I actually typically shoot on the other side to get the bride's reaction, but my second shooter has a 7200 which can get a lot closer than the lenses that I have, so I assign him to cover the bride reaction shots. Here just documenting kind of the candle lighting ceremony here, and again I don't know why, but shooting at 1/125th of a second. And heading back to the back of the church again, you'll see that I did fix my exposure to ISO 3200 with shutter speed 1/200 of a second. And then for this particular church ceremony, they did have some cultural rituals that they do, which is specifically the veil and the cord. And for these, again, I'm just taking kind of like that safe straight down the middle of the aisle shot with a telephoto to get close crop. And there's another reading here, and in order to kind of like isolate just the reader itself, I do kind of try to shoot through or like in between the guests to kind of like make them stand out a little bit more. It's always good to just ask a couple if there's any specific parts of the ceremony that they want captured. In this case, capturing the Eucharist was a important part for the couple. And here I'm getting a more telephoto shot of the bride and groom having the cord and the veil on. And then here I'm taking a wider shot of when they're starting to remove the cord and veil. And a pro tip, if you're shooting a Catholic wedding ceremony, it's always good to ask the couple if they're going to do any type of flower offering to the Mother Mary, just because when this happens, it's usually on some like satellite area of the church, and it always happens right before the kiss. So if you're not prepared, you might either be trying to follow them to take pictures of the offering and not be able to make it to the kiss, or vice versa. So immediately when they start walking back to the altar, I hoof it back to the back of the church again, just to make sure I'm prepared to capture that kiss shot. Taking one more shot with the 23mm before I switch out for the 16, and here I switch over to the 16mm 1.4 and the 35mm 1.4 in order to prepare for the kiss shot. I'm going to have my second shooter shoot the telephoto shot just because again he has a 7200, so I'm going to cover the wide angle for the kiss. And here I'm shooting this at 16mm at f2.8 ISO 3200 just to make sure everything is nice and crisp. Right before they start to process, you can see me switching over to autofocus continuous to capture the processional out of the church. And here I just kind of like track backwards and just capture having the autofocus point on the bride's face. And after the couple recesses out, I actually don't really bother with capturing the processional of the rest of the bridal party or the family, just because I usually never end up delivering that anyway, and nobody really complains about not getting those shots. Instead, I focus on setting up my flashes for the family portraiture. This is the only time that the church allows flashes to be set up. Here I have my 12-foot Alamaster light stands with I believe a 30-inch shoot through umbrella. Here I have the Yongnuo flashes, but since then I've moved over to Godux 8200s. But the mentality for how I use flashes is still pretty much the same. I'm going to set up one flash 45 degrees pointed to where the family is going to be standing, and I have another flash that's going to be set up on the other side that my second shooter is kindly setting up for me. And then once we got that all in, I do have my second shooter just stand in as a test subject for my lighting, just to make sure that's all dialed in. So I basically expose the shot so that the ambient lighting conditions are just a little bit darker than what the key flash power is. And I have the flash power set so that it keeps me at 1600 ISO or below when I'm set at a 2.8 aperture for group shots. And you might think that 2.8 isn't enough to get everybody in focus, but the key really is to have everyone stand in a straight line, perpendicular to where you're pointing your lens, so that they're all relatively in the same plane of focus. And there's no real way to kind of like finesse the family shots as it's super hectic. So just be loud and command the crowd, tell people where they need to stand. All right, ready, 1, 2, and 3. But for those who are able to stick around, I do want to reward you guys with a little behind the scenes coverage of a mini portrait session with this stained glass that I found at the front of the church. So first things first is try not to waste a couple's time, and actually I started dialing in my exposure settings before they even walked over. That way as soon as they got over, I could just quickly work with them and go through my poses and the lighting setup that I had in mind. So for this shot, I basically always have the couple pretty much down very close together, but here it's very key to have the groom just kind of like pull the bride in a little bit closer at the hips, and that way it really conveys that intimacy. And most couples' initial reaction when they're standing that close together is like looking at each other in the eye, so I like to have people kind of like get their foreheads a little bit closer. Sometimes I have it touch, but for this case this would be more of a silhouette, so you want a little bit small separation of the foreheads, that way it doesn't look like a big blob. After I get the pose pretty much dialed in, I do kind of like check the composition. I'm not afraid to move them even just like a smidge over. Here they're kind of like an inch off, so I have to move them. I have you guys just like an inch, like this way, like an inch. Right there you go. It's always better to get it right in camera than having to just try to experiment and fix it after the fact. So the first shot is with the 16mm 1.4. As you notice, I'm holding the camera up higher and pointing it down just a little bit. That way it avoids that unwanted wide angle distortion for the portraits. And next, I kind of step back a little bit with the 35mm 1.4. Get a little bit more flatter, compressed look, and to be able to capture the entire window here. And just stepping a little bit closer for another horizontal closer up shot of the couple. And then the final shot here, I do just try to do a little bit more experimentation with the bride's veil. I just kind of like float it around a little bit with the wide angle lens, the 16mm 1.4 again, to see if it kind of like can get some cool effects. And the wide angle here is going to kind of like distort the veil to look a lot bigger than it really is, and kind of like lead the eye over to the right to where the couple is standing. If you want to see some more in-depth videos on how I kind of work with couples with the posing and the lighting, again, let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, that kind of wraps up this low light wedding ceremony behind the scenes coverage. I can definitely say that wedding ceremony was pushing the Fujifilm X-T3 to its limits. So if you're still on the fence about switching over to the Fujifilm X-T3 for your wedding photography, I'm hoping that this video gave you a realistic expectation of its low light capabilities, especially when it comes to image quality, high ISO performance, and autofocus in low light. And if you already own or shoot weddings with the Fujifilm X-T3, I'm hoping that talking through my settings and my thought process on how I got the shots will help you guys better shoot weddings in the future. If you're curious about the gear that I use, I've got links in the description down below, as well as links to other helpful videos for Fujifilm wedding photographers, including how I sharpen my photos, how I edit my photos, and how I approach different type of lighting situations. If you want to see more behind the scenes videos like this one, hit that like button and let me know down in the comments below which next wedding photography situation you want to see. And please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I make a new Fujifilm or photography video like these two every other week. And if you want to see more of my photo work, go ahead and follow me on Instagram at ReggieBPhoto for new posts every single day. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.